and the fourth principle became the second principle, which now reads, "We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant and affirm to promote justice, equity, and compassion in human relations." In the Tapestry of Faith, the simple version puts it as follows: "We believe that all people should be treated fairly and kindly." Justice, equity, and compassion are the lived values of a free faith. In 1981, a story appeared in the Chicago Tribune about Mother Teresa and the then president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, Eugene Pickett. They were each asked the question of life's final meaning. Her answer was to become holy and go to heaven. Pickett's response was, "The purpose of life is to become whole and to create a heaven on earth." Central to the meaning of being a Unitarian Universalist is the for others commitment to the service of life. It is a key expression of being spiritual and ethical human beings. The unity of all beings binds us together in one human family. Our concerns are global in nature, but no one should be excluded. Affirming and promoting justice, equity, and compassion in human relations articulates the UU tradition, "To be is to be for others," is how the theologian Gene Reeves put it. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations points us to something beyond inherent worth and dignity. It points us to the larger community. It gets at collective responsibility. It reminds us that treating people as human beings is not simply something that we do one-on-one, but something that has systemic implications and can inform our entire cultural way of being. Let's examine each of the three words: justice, equity, and compassion. What do they mean to you? How would you define them in your life? Justice can be defined as just behavior or treatment, the quality of being fair and reasonable. Immanuel Kant distinguished justice from other moral principles by noting that the rules of justice pertain exclusively to external actions and do not depend on virtuous motivations for their fulfillment. It is primarily for this reason that only the rules of justice can be properly the subject of human legislation. We cannot compel others to be virtuous, since virtue presupposes a free act of the will. But we can rightfully compel others to observe the rules of justice and punish those who violate rights. Justice generally deals with larger social contexts. It implies fair distribution of social benefits and burdens. Justice allocates resources based on need, not greed. Justice, properly understood, is systemic, aiming at the underlying social problems, not their symptoms. A systemic approach challenges the underlying premises and working of economics that produce poverty in the midst of plenty. A systemic approach deals with policy issues, taxation, government welfare programs, and income distribution. Systemic change is the most effective way to achieve social justice. Kant's theory of justice and individual rights is as follows: any opposition that counteracts the hindrance of an effect promotes that effect and is consistent with it. Now, everything that is unjust is a hindrance to freedom, according to universal laws. Coercion, however, is a hindrance or opposition to freedom. Consequently, if a certain use of freedom is in itself a hindrance to freedom, according to universal laws, that is, it is unjust, then the use of coercion to counteract it, inasmuch as it is the preservation of a hindrance to freedom, is consistent with freedom according to universal laws. In other words, this use of coercion is just. It follows by law of contradiction that justice, a right, is united with the authorization to use coercion against anyone who violated justice or a right. Here we get to the source of those crying that their individual rights trump all others' rights within a community. The right to freedom does not include the freedom to violate the rights of others. Therefore, force used to protect our right to freedom is morally justifiable, whereas force used to violate our right to freedom amounts to nothing more than mere violence. And I think this applies to what is going on with some of the people who are anti-maskers and who believe they can go out and impose their will upon others. Their rights end where others began. And when they violate that line between their rights and others, that is when justice steps in. Equity is defined as just and fair inclusion. An equitable society is one in which all can participate and prosper. The goals of equity must be to create conditions that allow all to reach their full potential. Compassion comes from the Latin com, meaning together, and pati, meaning to suffer. In other words, to suffer together. There are times when our only response to another's pain is to share it. Often our response has been toward social reform rather than pastoral care, as if the two were unrelated. Unitarian Universalists seek to create caring communities in our congregations, a mutual ministry of coping with life, realizing that none of us can navigate life solely. Compassion is something we can act on as individuals. We can give people respect and treat them with kindness on our own. But we need one another to achieve equity and justice. If we learn to walk in another's shoes, and if we truly see one another as real people, we will act with compassion. And when that is true, we are all motivated to act with equity and justice. Justice, equity, and compassion are all a part of the same package. Just as the second principle overlaps and builds on the first principle, it is related to the seventh principle. When we change laws, we help people change attitudes. In our Unitarian Universalist tradition, we uphold the power of the question. We constantly search for truth and meaning. The second principle of justice, equity, and compassion is an excellent tool for that questioning. We can look at the world around us daily and ask the question, does this institution practice justice, equity, and compassion? Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations is a high calling, but it does not excuse us as UUs from trying to live it as best we can. Everyone deserves to be treated with compassion and respect. If we treat each person we meet as a human being, the practice just keeps on spreading. If we do it for one another, we are likely to pass it on further. If each person feels called to treat each other person with justice, equity, and compassion, we start creating institutions that reflect that attitude. Soon we are living justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. May we always strive to make it so. And now those who want to contribute to the conversation can step to the mic and go for it.
I have a question. The equity part was very short, and I'm a little less clear about it. Could you kind of summarize that?
When I looked at equity in all the different ways you can look at it online, it's defined as just and fair inclusion. That's equity.
Okay.
And across the board, Wikipedia, the dictionary, all the sources came down to just and fair inclusion equals equity. So there wasn't a long definition. But if we are just and fair, then our society can all participate and prosper, which is my conclusion to the whole thing. So we must create those conditions which allow everyone to prosper, not just a select few to rise as the cream of the crop.
So the inclusion part is a very important aspect. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chuck.
Good morning, I'm Rob. During the recent trial over the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, there was a lot of cry for justice at the trial, not his trial, but the trial. And I came away with a different take on that, in that justice would have been, or equity, compassion, would have been if Ahmaud Arbery had gone jogging through that neighborhood without being held captive and murdered.
Anyone else have thoughts? Okay. Then we have a closing music, and one of the things, yes, Chuck?
Just another comment. It seems to me that one of the biggest challenges right now with the society that we're living in is the issue of inclusion. People talk about justice, unfortunately, without defining it much, and I appreciate the history you gave us about the UUA and how we see that. But there's a real issue about inclusion and exclusion, and the people who will benefit from exclusion versus those that benefit from inclusion. So it seems to me that's one of our biggest challenges right now, particularly coming out of a liberal tradition which includes inclusion as a major focus of our work.
Agreed.
First of all, thank you for all the work that you do on these. It's obvious that you've done a lot of research, and it's appreciated. I agree with Chuck that inclusion is maybe the most important part of that principle. And I hope someone else can remember this. Probably it was a meme, I suppose, but it was to show the difference between equality and equity. And it had a fence, and then it had 3 people standing on the boxes they were standing on were of different heights. I don't know if anybody else remembers. I'm not sure I'm remembering this quite right. And so equality that's the one I'm having trouble with, because I think equity was you raise the boxes to different levels, because everyone doesn't start out on the same box. But what that reminds me of is in a couple of different workshop training things. I particularly remember it when we were doing the Beloved Conversations, doing that exercise where everyone starts out at the same line, and then they say, if you were born into a middle-class family, take 2 steps forward. Take 2 steps. If you were able to go to college, take 2 steps forward. If you were born into a white family, they included privilege in that, and how far people got across that from that starting line, and there's also, I think, a video of this too. It really brought home how there is not equity in our society, and those kinds of things, rather than just making it a mental exercise, I think are very powerful. They were very powerful to me. That equality and if anybody can remember what that meme was, where for equality versus equity, it was very clear, and I can't make it any clearer.
Thanks, Janine.
Okay, with justice and equity, I think you often see this in the general culture with in a discussion in terms of the opportunity versus result. So, this, I think in recent years in a lot of Supreme Court cases, that's come up with, in looking at a particular issue, do we look at the opportunity or the actual result of what a policy is, more, especially like with affirmative action. I think in more recent times with the conservative bent of the Supreme Court, they're looking just at opportunity as some abstract concept where, in my thinking, if you do that, then you're accepting the hierarchy in the power structure and you're avoiding the systemic issues. Yet at the same time, if you start looking at the actual results, that is difficult. It's how do you change policies so you end up with the result, like representation on corporate boards or in colleges. So it's a difficult issue, but for me, that's where compassion comes in. If you want to just keep your privileged position, then you're going to focus just on justice and equity as opportunity. Hey, we gave you a chance, you didn't use it, so I'm off the hook. But when you start bringing compassion into the equation, that's where I think you start to realize, well, this person or this group of people, for many different reasons, don't end up at the same position in the starting line. And to me, that's where compassion makes you start to think more about what are the actual results of the policies that we're using, where we can start addressing some of the more systemic issues.
Right. Sometimes opportunities can't be addressed by the underprivileged because they don't have the wherewithal or the situation where they can take advantage of it.
Right, and that, you like I say, you give them more of a chance in one area, but then you're ignoring the 10 other barriers they may face.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you, Bill. Anyone else? Come on up, Lou.
Hello, I'm Lou Hoover. If there's anybody here that doesn't know that. I've been doing a lot of reading lately about Black issues. And one of the books I read was written by a woman who was an expert in income tax. And she, you find problems in the strangest places. She was talking about the joint income tax, which I suppose most of us take It's something my husband and I have always signed up for joint income tax because it seemed a little more advantageous. But the truth is, I didn't understand it very well. She said that this came about because some very wealthy man who had a wife who didn't work at all realized that if they could pool their incomes, they would pay less tax. It would place him in a lower, and maybe the rest of you have always understood this. I didn't get it. Anyway, so that becomes a problem for black people because black people tend to both work. The couples, and this is probably true of Unitarians too, that if you're both working, you don't get any benefit out of that particular tax break. And so that seems to me like a place where inequity crops up where you never expected it. And I wanted to say just a little comment about Janine's fence thing. It seems to me that if you were standing on the same size boxes, that would be equality. If you were facing a fence of the same height, that would be equity. Just a thought.
Thank you, Lou. Anyone else? Okay, I wanted to make a comment about the music before we do our closing music. And that is, we are trying to use UU approved music for streaming. And hopefully it is going to work. Okay, so here we have our closing music.
Can I see another's woe and not be in sorrow too? Can I see another's grief and not seek for kind relief? Can I see a falling tear and not feel my sorrow share? Can a father see his child weep, nor be with sorrow filled? Can a mother sit and hear infant groan and infant fear? No, no, never can it be. Never, never can it be.
Our closing words for today, first from St. Francis. In the words of St. Francis and then of Buddha, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, joy. Grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, it is in dying to self that we are born to life. And from Buddha, however many holy words you read, however many you speak, what good will they do if you do not act on them? Go in peace until we meet again. write down my answer. Yes. But he has a lot of good information about things like equality and justice and compassion. Anytime you enter those words into a search, he comes up. Uh-huh. When we had 6 instead of 7, and we're definitely going to have 8 or more when they get done with this monumental task that they don't pay. That's it. Yes, exactly. And then tapestry faith puts it even more straight. Yeah, because the ones for the kids make more sense now. Clear and concise. Yep. You're welcome.